now officially in Unit 1, Basic Real Estate Concepts, as it follows along with the syllabus and the learning management system. Now, take some solace in the fact that some of the things I'm about to get into next are a lot easier than that. They don't stay that way for long, but these next couple little tidbits are a lot easier than everything we just kind of talked about. So here's where we start actually following the syllabus to a T, okay? We get into what we call basic real estate concepts in this section. And just generalized things about understanding real estate and some language like the difference between land and real estate and real property and the difference between real property and personal property and things of that nature. So I'm going to be completely honest with you. This section is not incredibly testable. These are just so rudimentary that like you may get a question or two, but more than anything, this like builds up on some other concepts throughout the course. So basic real estate concepts is where we're jumping into next. Now I keep using the term real property, right? And I said, well, don't get so caught up in the term real property because that's not what you probably hear more often than not. You're probably used to hearing real estate. I'll get into that a little bit more in a second, but let's just keep going with the term real property. Well, folks, just about everything, maybe not everything, but just about everything could be categorized into real property or personal property. So when I say real property, of course, land and the houses on it and the things attached to it and things of that nature, right? And then personal property is everything else. Your couches, your clothes, your chairs, your furniture. Why is this important in the real estate industry? Well, because if we're helping somebody buy a house, the biggest question that they want to know is, well, what comes with it? Most of us know that when you buy a house, you're not getting that person's couch, you're not getting their furniture, you're not getting a lot of the things within it. And so that's how we kind of categorize it. There's part of the real property, and if it's part of the real property, you get it. And if it's not, then you don't. Real property versus personal property. Now, let's go ahead and provide the clarification on this term real property that we're going to use more often than not, folks. There is some slight nuance and differentiation between these three words: land, real estate, real property. Now, before I teach you the differences, understand something. We're never trying to trick you on a test that's like a contract question, right? If they say such and such is purchasing a piece of land, such and such is purchasing a piece of real estate, such and such is purchasing a piece of real property, it doesn't matter. Interpret the question the same. The only time the difference matters is if we directly ask you, what is the difference between land and real estate? Or what is the difference between real estate and real property? That is the only time the differences matter. Everybody with me? Because there are technical and subtle differences, but that's the only time we care on the test is if we directly ask you, what is the difference? Otherwise, we're not trying to trick you. Plenty of things we try to trick you on. This is not it. So when I say land, folks, what comes to mind? If I just say the word land, what do you think about?
The ground.
The ground, me too. Anything else? Dirt, I like that. Undeveloped land. Trees, I like that. Plants, ground, open fields. Yeah. All the above, naturally existing, like that. Folks, when we say land...
Something unimproved.
Say again?
Something like, unimproved.
Unimproved, yeah. Absolutely. I like all those, and my mind goes to very similar places. Folks, when we think about land, we think about dirt and soil and unimproved and all these different things. And so when we're dealing with real estate and the basic concept of land, land is the earth's surface, the dirt, the soils, the things that you pointed out to me. And then even more than that, when we refer to land, we're actually talking about everything above and everything below it as well. The inherent ownership of land typically includes subsurface rights. In other words, we say your ownership goes down to the center of the earth and it goes upwards to infinity. You are said to own the air above your land as well. So the basic definition of land, the earth's surface, everything above, everything below. Of course, when we're getting into it, the naturally occurring things are part of that, as you said. Your trees, your plants, your creeks, your shrubs, all of that would inherently be included. That's land. So everything on the earth's surface and above and below it, natural things. So when we upgrade to the word real estate, which is the word that you're arguably more familiar with, and we are talking about a real estate broker's license, even though we more often use the word real property, the definition of real estate is the land, as we just defined it, plus all attachments thereon, both man-made and artificial. So yeah, your trees, your creeks, and everything just like land before, but now we're going to include any man-made attachments as well. Homes, offices, fences, patios, sidewalks, septic systems, right? These are what we call improvements. We're going to talk about that word improvement later. So if I said, well, what's the difference between the definition of land and real estate? Real estate includes the man-made attachments thereon as well, plus the earth's surface, everything above and everything below, which is part of land. What you got, Brooks?
So I read this a few days ago, and does that qualify? Because I think in the book it says that is permanently attached to the land. So like a trailer park, technically you're not buying the land that the trailer's on, even if you do own the trailer, right?
Depends, but yes, you're absolutely right. So there's that adult diapers thing, right? It depends, and so you're on it. We're actually gonna have some very in-depth conversations about like manufactured homes versus modular homes and some differentiations there, because that is a very testable concept. So you're absolutely right. You're onto something there. Yeah. So that's all there is to real estate. Now, the next one up, the real property, that's the word I keep throwing out there, especially when we're talking about the criteria for is a license required. And so here's the only difference, okay? They kind of are a step up. So when you go from real estate, by the way, the word realty is synonymous with real estate. We have all these kind of crazy terms that are just, weird, and you just got to go with it. Realty, real estate, same thing. So the next one is real property. And real property takes the definition of real estate, but it also is said to include what we call a bundle of legal rights. It is this concept of legal rights that come with the ownership of the land, which is the earth's surface, everything above and below, all attachments, both man-made and natural, thereon. And it is said now in real properties is being discussed to include this bundle of legal rights. Now, we're going to talk about the bundle of legal rights more in just a second. It's the right of disposition, exclusion, enjoyment, possession, and control. Don't worry about writing that down yet. There's a slide for it. But it's this bundle of legal rights that are said to come with real property ownership. And so, as I just mentioned, if we're talking about purchasing something on a contract, we don't care about using the word real property, real estate, or land. We're not trying to trick you. I'm telling you, the only time the differences matter is if the test question says, what is the difference between real estate and real property? And you would have to say real property includes a bundle of legal rights. That's it. It's the only time we care about these differences. Otherwise, this is just rudimentary stuff. Now, when we're dealing with real property, there's some things that we're going to introduce here, but we're going to talk about them more in depth in later chapters and later sections. And so when we get into the different characteristics of real property, more specifically, let's start with the physical characteristics of real property, right? Physical being tangible things that you can acknowledge, that you can realize, that you can touch, that you can perceive, right? They're attributes, if you will. So when we're talking about the physical characteristics of real property, it is identified by immobility. Folks, it means it doesn't move. Houses can move, trees can move, but land in and of itself does not move. It's immobile. Sure, you can move dirt. But the parcel of land, folks, this is horrible, but when you're talking about things like what just happened in Western North Carolina, people's houses are gone. People's land is underwater, but technically that parcel of land still exists, just in a different format. The longitude and latitude still exist. So real estate is immobile overall. More specifically, the land is immobile. Of course, the next aspect is indestructibility. Yet again, not the houses, not the structures, not the trees, the land. Topography can change, but at the end of the day, the land is indestructible in and of itself. And then the last one is uniqueness. Folks, in other words, there are no two pieces of property in the entire world that are identical. And that's just a fact. Similar, yes, right? They can be the same style of house. They can be a very similar lot. They can be a similar location, but they'll never be identical, which introduces some very unique words that go with the word uniqueness. Now, folks, listen. Bless their hearts, there are some people who get offended, and I'm not making this up, okay? There are some people who get offended at these words that I'm about to share and like, oh, it sounds like you're talking about sexual orientation. No, sweetness, sexual orientation is designed after these Latin root words, okay? So the first word is non-homogeneity. Homo means same, okay? So when it's non-homo, it means not the same. So non-homogeneity means not the same, or in other words, it's unique. Well, hetero means different. And so heterogeneity means not the same. You see how those words mean the exact same thing? That's like a heterosexual prefers the not the same sex person, and a homosexual prefers the same sex. It's the same root word. This is not pulling from gender orientation or, sexual attractive orientation or whatever. These are root words from Latin, folks. Like, don't get weird about them. That's all it is. Uniqueness. Non-homogeneity. Not the same. Heterogeneity, also not the same. Uniqueness. Every single piece of property is unique. There are no two pieces that are the same. So these are all part of your physical characteristics of real property. Then we also have what we call economic characteristics. Now these have a little bit more of a flow to them because there's this acronym, if you will, this mnemonic, whatever you want to call it, and it is SLIP. And so that is scarcity, location, improvements, and permanence. So scarcity goes back to Economics 101. Supply and demand curve, if you will. The more of something there is, the less valuable there is. The more of a limited supply, the more valuable it becomes. Okay, supply and demand curves. Now, arguably, land is not scarce. There is a lot of land in the world. However, it is scarce in certain locations. It is scarce in downtown Raleigh. It is scarce in downtown Charlotte. It is scarce in Wilmington. It is scarce, it's scarce in a lot of places. And so when it becomes more finite and more scarce in a given location, the value goes up. That is why scarcity is a big economic characteristic of real property. Folks, there's plenty of land out there, plenty of affordable land. You just don't want to live there. Why? Because it's negative 500 degrees and there's nothing to do around there. Of course it's going to be affordable. But there's plenty of it. The next one is location. Folks, they always joke that the three most important characteristics of a piece of real estate, location, location, location. It goes back to what I just said. It's not scarce in general, but it's scarce in a desirable location, which once again increases the value. Improvements goes back to what we said, like houses. Well, folks, if I offered you a 4-bedroom, 3-bathroom house that checked all the boxes versus a piece of land that you could put a tent on, the house is probably going to be more valuable to most of you because most of you probably don't want to live in a tent. So improvements, of course, make the property more valuable. And it could be infrastructure as well. It doesn't have to be a house. Septics and sewers and sidewalks and infrastructure also are considered improvements that increase the value of property. And then the last one is P for permanence. Real estate in general, or real property in general, has always been considered a very permanent style of investment. They typically last for a very long time, typically maintain values, and of course have a tendency to appreciate and grow at a steady rate or sometimes even a faster rate than inflation. So they've been a very permanent investment. Of course, outliers to everything like some of these storms we've seen, but overall, very permanent investment. Now, let's go back to this location, folks. There's a term for location preference. This is a vocab word. It's a flashcard level word, nothing in depth. It's called situs, S-I-T-U-S. Situs is just a fancy word for where you prefer to be. And this goes back to what I said. If you could pick between a metropolis that had a lot of fun things to do, great restaurants, great economy, good job opportunities, you're probably considering that area more desirable over somewhere where there's 17,000 acres of nothing but farm fields and negative 20 degree weather and no jobs. So situs is just a fancy word for area preference. Where do you prefer to be? It's just a flashcard level thing. Now, yet again, I'm going to reiterate, some of these things I'm just introducing as language, but they're going to show up in later sections like the valuation section and more in depth. And so here's a prime example of that. This is what we call a economic characteristic or, characteristic of value. It's called the principle of highest and best use. And what it basically is this principle that a property has one given use at any given time that maximizes its value or its rate of return. Now understand that not every property is being utilized for its highest and best use. And that highest and best use could change. A couple examples, folks. What is now some of the main shopping areas in Briar Creek used to be farmland. So at a certain period in time, that highest and best use was farmland, and now it's condominiums and mixed use and things of that nature. Same thing near RDU International Airport. They used to have a motel, and that motel was there for quite some time, and they realized that they no longer thought that motel was the highest and best use of that given piece of property, so they demolished it, and they put the parking garages that are now at the airport, and they deemed that to be the highest and best use at a time. So another example, Disney World. Folks, there is nothing you can put in the swamplands of Florida that would be worth more, have a higher return than what Disney World is probably doing down there. So just a concept within real estate. Not every property is being utilized for its highest and best use, but there is what we call a highest and best use analysis, where third-party companies can kind of look at a property and determine what may be the highest and best use. Now, here's another introduction into a more in-depth section that we're going to get down the road. Folks, when we're dealing with land ownership, let me backtrack here for a second. Let me ask you a question. If you own your home, are you allowed to do whatever you want with it? No. Depends. Got some no's in the chat. Say again?
Whatever the HOA says you can do.
Whatever the HOA says you can do? Yeah.
It's within the law, yes.
Sure. The short answer is no, and the longer answer is maybe, and then the longer answer even still within the law. Here's the thing. Even if you own your property, you are still typically subject to what we call public and private land use controls. Now, this has its own section later, but public land use controls is the law. So it is zoning and ordinances and what the government says you can and can't build in a certain municipality. Folks, it's the reason why, and some of you are probably happy about this and some of you are probably upset, it's the reason why your neighbor can't turn his home and your cul-de-sac into a strip club and bar, okay? The government won't let him because zoning doesn't allow it. And I'm sure some of you appreciate that, and some of you would be walking the dog every night. Listen, honey, I'm going to walk the dog for the third time. Is that a stack of ones in your hand? Nope. It's just a leash. Just a leash, right? Folks, the government does have some say in what you can and can't do with your property. It's called public land use controls for the greater good of the municipality. So that goes back to what y'all said. What you can do whatever within the scope of the law. But then I think it was Jack who said about the HOA. Well, not every property has an HOA, but some do. And restrictive covenants and HOAs fall into what we call private land use controls, restrictions imposed by private property owners. The government doesn't care, but because when you own land, you can say what can and can't happen to it. You can impose restrictions that bind future property owners. Good, bad, or otherwise, these things always exist. So we're going to talk about these in greater detail down the road, but public and private land use controls are a very big conversation throughout this course. Now, when we're talking about real estate as an investment, I already kind of mentioned one of the biggest things that real estate as an investment is good for, and that is that permanence piece and the good rate of return. The biggest downside is we're just kind of introducing some of these basic real estate concepts of real estate as an investment is it lacks liquidity. That just is a fancy word for saying it takes time to turn it into cash. Right? If you have stocks, you can sell them tomorrow. Maybe not for the highest return, but you can sell them tomorrow. Same thing with some other investments. But real estate, you got to make sure it's clean. You got to list it. You got to find a buyer. You got to do a title search. You got to transfer. It's a process to turn it into cash. So it lacks liquidity, but it does have some other advantages like very desirable tax benefits like deductions and depreciations and things of that nature. Now, here's where I'm going to warn you about something between what I'm teaching you and what you're going to see in the online program, folks. I mentioned yesterday that I am not allowed to see the state licensing exam. It's under lock and key. I have no idea what's on it. Here's the thing. There is a very lovely lady who is like the main point of contact for the state licensing exam. And over my years of asking her what's on it, her response has always been, Seth, if it's on the syllabus, it can be on the exam. And I said, well, that's so helpful. Thank you. And I've always taken that to heart. And, you know, that's why I kind of focus on the things on the syllabus. Here's where I'm going with that, though. There are going to be questions in your online program and from your textbook and some of the resources that I've built for you that I may not have gone over in great detail. Don't panic. It's because I'm focusing on what I know to be the hardest and most testable things. I'm not going to remove the other things out of your material. I'm just not going to focus on them. And so here's what I mean. I'm going to talk about some categories of real estate and specializations in real estate, but I promise you, if you haven't looked at it yet, when you go to take quiz number 1 and unit number 1 in your online program, you're going to have questions. You're going to be like, Seth didn't talk about this. No, I didn't. Because we didn't need to. Am I going to remove it from the material? No. You can just learn it there. Does that make sense for everybody? I'm going to focus on the most testable, the most important things. But I'm also not going to remove some of these outlier questions that, who knows, arguably could appear on the exam. So just, you know, understand that you're going to see things you're like, I don't remember talking about this. We probably didn't. But it just wasn't that important. So categories of real estate, folks, this is, depending on who you ask, sometimes they categorize it different. Of course, this is residential and commercial. I would argue that some people would say that industrial, agriculture, and special purpose are all grouped under commercial. But at the end of the day, in North Carolina, we basically consider anything that's 1 to 4 units residential. Anything greater than 4 units, and of course, unimproved land is considered a type of commercial. Well, that goes back to that LNCL. When somebody asked me about like managing an Airbnb, no, a single unit would still be residential. That's not commercial. The LNCL, though, would be good to purchase a 5-plex and up. The LNCL would be good to purchase raw land. It'd be good to do commercial leases. It'd be good to purchase agricultural. You can do everything except 1 to 4 units with that LNCL. So that's kind of the breakdown there. And of course, understand too, folks, when we're dealing with a North Carolina broker's license, you are allowed to do all of these with a North Carolina broker's license. There is no specialized license for commercial. I'm referring to that LNCL because that's what your brain can associate right now. But your broker's license in North Carolina is good for residential. It's good for commercial. It's good for property management. It's good for everything, right? But those are all specialized skill sets that you have to learn more about before you tackle them. But it's good for all of that. What you got, Beverly?
So when you're saying anything over 4 units, is that 4 units on one dominant? Like
Yes.
one?
5-plex or more.
Huh?
What I mean is a 5-plex or more. So like attached. So if you're purchasing like up to a quadruplex, meaning you're purchasing one building that has 4 dwelling units attached, that's still residential. But if you're purchasing one building with 5 dwelling units attached, that's considered a commercial transaction. Yeah. And of course, 10-unit apartment complexes, 20-unit apartment, everything over 5 and over, it would be commercial. Yeah. So within real estate, there are, of course, some very big specializations. Folks, real estate is a multi-trillion, with a T, multi-trillion dollar industry. And so there is a lot of different pieces of it. Of course, you folks are all endeavoring into the fun and fantastical world of brokerage, helping people facilitate deals, lessors, lessees, buyers, sellers, and everything in between, and getting commissions and compensations for it. Of course, there are appraisers who value the properties for lending institutions. There are investors who purchase properties for long-term holdings and or to rent out for cash flow. There are the surveyors who go out and work with civil engineers to draft community plans, to design buildings. There's architects who create buildings. There is, of course, property managers, both residential and commercial. There is lending institutions that make their money off interest. There are developers who purchase property, turn it from raw land into infrastructure, or sell the lots. And then there's a little more interesting side, like coaching and education. Folks, let me go ahead and tell you something right here, right now, because this is kind of a cool thing that I think a lot of brokers don't think about. I'm going to be completely honest with you. There is a large number of people who go through this class And they've seen HGTV and they've seen Selling Sunset and they're like, oh, that looks like such a fun and cool job. And then they get into it and they're like, that kind of sucks, right? It's not for the faint of heart. It's a little more work than a lot of people think. But the thing is, there is a lot of things you can do with your license other than residential sales. So if you get your license and you don't just like absolutely love residential sales in your first year, get creative. There's other things you can do with your license. Folks, I did general brokerage for 6 years. Of course, I managed firms at the same time. So I did a lot of things in that first 6 years. But I personally found I much would rather be here. You know, I did the sales, I managed the firms, I did all that stuff. I'd rather teach y'all. So I'm still using my license every single day, and I still do some sales. I just had a listing go live yesterday, but it's not where I like to focus. So there's a lot of different things within the real estate industry, and sometimes people get into brokerage and then they'll switch and they'll become a lender. So just some food for thought. Now this is where you're going to see some questions in the online program and you're gonna be like, well, we didn't talk about it specifically. Yeah, that's because you can kind of figure it out. It's gonna say like, which of the following would be an example of somebody who was, you know, primarily in the investing side of things. And you just got to think about, you know, what would an investor kind of probably do from a specialization point of view. We don't need to get into that because that's not going to be heavily testable. I don't want to waste your time. Still acknowledge the question, store it in your memory banks when you get there, but don't get upset about it. This is really the detail I think we need to go in these specializations right now. We've already talked about supply and demand. We're not going to spend time here. Just understand that real estate is a very cyclical thing. It kind of climbs, it levels out, it falls, climbs, level out, falls. There's some outliers. If you look up the real estate market cycle, there are always outliers like the housing market crisis of 2007, 2008. Of course, COVID was one. Now it's another. I mean, there's been several. The Great Depression was one. So it's just an ongoing thing. There is, you know, when interest rates are low, a surplus of buyers, which means there's a greater demand, less inventory, prices go up. Of course, as interest rates climb, the pool of buyers goes down, the demand goes down, and things kind of level off a little bit. And it's always been true of every resource. Real estate is no different. So this is just kind of showing you, as with any supply and demand curve, how this kind of flows. Nothing too crazy. Nothing you need to really commit to memory there. Which gets us to our fun-filled little bit of vocab. Now, one of these words I haven't introduced yet, so I'll kind of introduce it and table it at the same time. So, land, real estate, real property. Of course, land, earth surface, everything above and below. Real estate includes land plus all the man-made improvements and natural improvements attached to. And then real property is all that plus that bundle of legal rights that we're about to get into. Situs, that fancy vocab word for area preference. Where do you prefer to be? What is a more desirable area to you? Chattel is the word that has not been introduced yet, but it's coming up. So I'm going to table it, and we'll get there. And then, of course, economic versus physical characteristics. You know, that slip versus immobility, indestructibility, uniqueness for the economic versus physical. And those will kind of make a resurgence in later categories as well.